QSO Today, Episode 434, Quin Schultze K8QS. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Volts Magazine. Save the date for the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, March 25th and 26th, 2023. Follow the link to the Expo website for more information. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo returns in March 2023, just a month and a half away. I'm very excited by the presentations that are coming to the Expo. You can already see the list in real time as I accept them into the Expo. If you have a project or viewpoint that you would like to share that would help a fellow ham find his or her place on the air, please go to the Expo website and sign up. Quin Schultze K8QS began his ham radio journey as a teenager with modest means and found his calling in college, where he majored in communications, leading to a doctoral degree. Through Quin's Looking Glass, we discuss the uniqueness of our ham radio hobby, the communities that form within it, and the real estate in the ether that we tend while on the air. K8QS is my QSO Today. K8QS, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Quin?
Hey, Eric, it's Quin, K8QS. Great to talk to you today.
Well, it's great to talk to you today as well, Quin. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Just before we start, why don't you tell us where you are? You fly south for the winter?
Yeah. Well, I do a lot of speaking, primarily at universities and colleges, and get around quite a bit. So my main home is in western Michigan in the Grand Rapids area. I'm on the road right now, but I've stopped in the Blue Ridge Mountain area because our son and his family live here just south of Asheville. So we're here over the holidays, and then I'm back on the road again down through the south and speaking at a variety of places. And part of that is to get out of the winter there in Michigan, and then I'll probably be back in early March.
It sounds like that's the best way to stay out of the snow. I understand. I used to have some cable television systems in Tennessee and that part of the world. They do get ice storms up there.
Oh, yeah. In fact, we may get one here in the next few days. This is a lifetime cold front coming down, and I think we're supposed to have a low of 6 here just south of Asheville tomorrow night, and that is virtually unheard of.
It's cold, from what I understand.
Very cold.
So let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you? Where was the hometown? Okay,
so I grew up on the outskirts of Chicago, right by what's now O'Hare Airport. Before it was really much of an airport. It was kind of an Air Force base then. The area was semi-rural. We had deer in the backyard and the like. And it was there that I actually started listening to distance AM radio when I was a very little kid. I had an older brother, 9 years older, and he got a Buick. I think it was a 54 Buick or something like that. And he had installed a Cadillac radio. It was one of the first radios that would search for the next signal on the band. Had a little bar underneath it, and you would press that bar and it would go to the next signal. And sometimes I'd be out in the evening with him because he had to take care of me, and we'd be roaming around at night, and I could pick up these different AM stations around the country, from Little Rock and virtually everywhere this side that is east of the mountains, the Rockies, and I was fascinated by that. And so that, I think, was the beginning of my interest in radio. And there's something, by the way, Eric, that I think is primordial about radio that I'll get into more later. I think it's built into the human psyche, this communicating across distance. And so then when I was in about 6th grade, I had a friend who told me that he had a shortwave radio. I didn't even know what the heck that was exactly, but he said that he would loan it to me. And so I took this radio, I don't even remember what brand it was, and put it in my bedroom and set it up. And I started listening around on AM on 75 meters. And I remember before school in the morning, I would be listening to some of the hams talking back and forth, and I was fascinated about what they were talking about. It was not just rigs, but different places they lived and different ways they got into the hobby and what their neighborhoods were like and what their antennas were like. It was like another whole language or culture, but fascinating to me. And I thought I wanted to find out more about it. And I went to the library, and the library had QST magazines. And you could check them out after 2 months or so, new ones coming in. And I started checking those out and reading all about hobby. And they also had the ARRL's manual for the hobby, and I took that out. But I needed to meet local hams, and so I started looking around for antennas, and eventually I did meet some local hams. And I found out that there was a course to get your novice class license through the local YMCA. So I signed up for that. There were 3 of us in the class. I was the only one who completed it. I was surprised at the ham who was teaching the class. Wonderful man that stayed with it. But I got through there. I found the CW pretty easy and just loved the whole idea of being able to get on the air. And I got a receiver and started listening. I think it was a Helicrafter's S85. Started listening to CW. And once I got my ticket, which was probably 1967, I was off and running on CW.
And you got your first license then in 1965, did you say?
I think it was 1967. It was either 66 or 67, one of those.
And that was your novice license. How old were you?
Yeah, so I would have been about 15 or 16 at that time. And I was just, I believe I was just starting high school. And I think I was probably, was a little ahead of myself. I was probably about 15 and started making a lot of contacts on CW and meeting a lot of local people on CW, which for me was quite neat because then I could go and meet some of them, ride around on my bicycle. I had a terrible home life, and so one of the ways that I connected with people and developed relationships that were healthy was through ham radio. My father was an alcoholic, and he died when I was a freshman in high school. My mother was a paranoid schizophrenic, and she was incapable of raising me, so I was kind of raising myself. I had 2 brothers, but they were much, much older and were not around anymore. And my mother and I could barely survive financially. But I got a couple of jobs and started earning some money to get some equipment and meeting some people. And I found out right away that ham radio was as much a fellowship of people as it was something about technology, and that I could be part of this fellowship and I could have a lot of good friends. And so to some extent, ham radio was my escape from a very bad home life.
Do you remember the names and call signs of some of the adult hams that had the biggest influence on you?
Oh, yeah. I remember especially Ken, WA9 Victor David, he used to call himself, who was a crackerjack CW operator. And he introduced me to Jim, I'm trying to think of Jim's last name, who developed Helicrafter's W9TO Keir. Jim, I can't think of his last name, but and many other people as well. Ken was an interesting guy because he was blind. And for him, much of his community consisted of him on CW, and he became a very high-speed CW operator, part of the chicken fat operators, a CFO's group that I would occasionally drop in on. To have him as a friend, blind, he couldn't drive and come and pick me up, but he was close enough that I could bicycle over, and I got to know his whole family. And we started a group in that part of Chicago called the DRIPNet, the Des Plaines Region Interference Propagators, DRIP, DRIPNet. And we would get on every evening, 9 o'clock p.m. on, I think it was 28.6 on 10 meters. And we called ourselves the DRIPNet, the Interference Propagators, because at that time, with a lot of the AM equipment we were using, and with TVs not having proper filters, we would create a lot of interference with neighbors. Not as bad as on 6 meters, but it still got pretty bad. And I had a neighbor who would lob cherry bombs over on the lawn next to the trailer that I lived in with my mother when I would get on the air because I was causing interference. And there's a story about that in the YouTube channel that I co-host with a friend. It's called Ham Radio Perspectives. And there's a video we did on ham radio pranks. And that's one of the things that I cover in there. So I want to say to you, Eric, just up front, that it's the fraternal aspect of the hobby, the friendship, the community that for me was critically important in the beginning and still is.
Oftentimes, I think that's underplayed, but for a lot of kids, it makes a big difference if they come into it early enough and they connect with the right people. So you had a first station, the first station receiver, that Hallicrafter's S85, and what kind of transmitter did you have with that?
It was an S85, and then I built a transmitter. I used to go around with my bike and find TVs that people were throwing out along the curb, and I would grab the TV and haul it home on the back of the bike, and then I would cut out all the parts. And so I started creating just bags of parts from old TVs or radios. And then I ran across, I think it was a 2-tube transmitter plan that was in CQ magazine. It was relatively simple. So I built that thing. I got it working. It was, of course, back then with novices, you had to be crystal operated for transmit, so you wouldn't be wandering all over the band creating interference. And I had 2 crystals that I got somewhere. I think somebody loaned them to me. And I got this transmitter on probably, I think it was a 5-watt, and I believe the article was called something like Build Your Own Peanut Whistle. And so that's what I had to get started.
And how did you upgrade along the way?
Yeah, I got a couple of jobs and had some money coming in, and then some of these hams that I met had cars. My mother was never able, with her schizophrenia, to get a driver's license, so we had no vehicle. But some of the hams would take me around to ham fests in the area, and I started buying some other equipment and meeting other people and swapping equipment and all that stuff that you do. I think the first transmitter that I had that was commercially made was a Heathkit HX20, a very unusual piece of equipment. Had a single 6146 in the transmit for the final amp, and it was made for mobile use. But somehow I ran across that and got that working with the S85, and then slowly started upgrading. Antennas were a real problem for me because we lived in this mobile home park that had very limited space, and it was illegal to have antennas, off your property, but your property wasn't much of anything. And so I would sneak antennas out. I have a lot of memories of sneaking even across the road and stringing antennas. I got very interested in building HF antennas of various kinds, and it's been a lifelong hobby for me, Eric, to build antennas wherever I am, to experiment with them and try out different antennas. I love HF in part because of communicating with people all over the world, building friendships, but also because of the antennas.
What's the best antenna for a mobile home park?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it was a vertical, and I think I started with a Gotham vertical that with a little tap on a coil at the bottom, and it didn't work very well at all. And then I got a used Hustler 4BTV 4-band, and I put a bunch of little wires underground for the base on it, the grounding system, and it worked pretty well. And then eventually I moved that antenna. I built a platform out of wood. I put the antenna on top of the mobile home and attached for grounding to the rivets or whatever they were that were holding the roof on. So I was using the whole roof of the mobile home for the ground, and that worked very well.
And now this message from ICOM America. ICOM wants to wish you a Happy New Year. If Santa confused your wish list with that of someone else's, and a new battery-powered weed whacker is displayed under your tree, then it's not too late to return the mistake and head to your favorite ham radio dealer for one or all of the latest ICOM transceivers. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion with base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. It has become the go-to baseband rig for microwave operators. Its features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen display with a live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with a 13.8 DC power supply. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, a micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot. The HM243 microphone speaker is included, and it supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the ICOM 705 is the optional LC192 backpack. The LC192 includes a special compartment for your IC705 and additional room for accessories. The ICOM ID52A is a VHF-UHF dual-band handheld portable transceiver with D-Star and FM dual-mode functions and is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display. This portable supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. You can even send photos over D-Star using your connected Android device. Other ID52 features include a wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz, VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and of course, it is in an IPX7 waterproof case. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705 as both use batteries, headsets, and the same Android app for D-Star operation. Create your own band opening with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world and is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy, including faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. More features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD with real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed everyone's expectations. This transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. The ICOM IC7300 features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. This radio by far is the best HF rig that I have ever owned. I love it for its features and value. When it comes to amateur radio operators justifying a new transceiver purchase, Santa's confusion is one of the best explanations to your significant other, that you're only correcting Santa's embarrassing mistake. 2023 is just beginning, and there's no reason not to enjoy a single day of the new year operating your new ICOM transceiver. Head out to your ICOM dealer today to purchase your new ICOM rig. Be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, it really did. I became so interested in electronics, and I took an electronics course when I was in middle school, probably 7th grade or so. Had a nice textbook, so I learned a lot from that. The teacher was not a ham, but that got me interested in electronics as well. And I guess I would put it this way to you. There is a backstory for every ham, and our lives are not just about ham radio, of course. They're about all of life. They're about family and neighbors and technology and religious faith and all kinds of things. And all of that shapes how we view ourselves and how we pursue life. And for me, I got interested in this hobby because of the relational component, but I was also interested in the electronic part. I was a terrible student in high school. I think I I barely got a 2.0, enough to graduate. And the advisor said, well, you're probably not college material and so forth. And I thought, well, maybe that's true. But I thought maybe I should go into engineering. How would I do that? Maybe I could get into some university or tech school, trade school. But I went to take what was then the exam that you would take to go to college, the main one. And even though the advisor said I probably shouldn't, and I did extremely well on the thing, which just showed that I had a lot of potential that I wasn't meeting through regular school. And that was largely because of my home life. I was just trying to survive, trying to keep food on the table, keep my mother going. I mean, it was a very difficult situation. So school was not my primary effort, but I scored so well on that exam that I could go to any university in the state of Illinois free, tuition free. And so I picked the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana because that was the one that everybody told me was not only the best school for studying engineering in the state, but one of the best in the world. You know, that's where they had, before I got there, invented the transistor, and where they had one of the first, I remember it actually, the first big supercomputers called ILIAC. And Silicon Valley actually came out of that place. Now, that's a weird story that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but the one of the inventors of the transistor, who was a professor of engineering there before I arrived, had a sick mother. So he moved out to the San Francisco area to take care of her and developed what became Silicon Valley. Otherwise, Silicon Valley would not have been in the current Silicon Valley area. So I arrived at the University of Illinois to study engineering, and I realized that engineering is made up of largely introverts. And I was not an introvert by nature. I was an introvert because of what I grew up in. I was scared of relationships. I had very few clothes. I felt like a dork, and old term there in high school, and also I didn't communicate with many people except through ham radio. When I arrived at the university, I thought I started making friends who were not in engineering, and they were really interesting people. And I thought, man, there's another whole world out there. And then in one of my engineering classes, they started talking about engineering gone wrong, these great designs that people had that failed and why they failed, and where the effects of technology was different from what the intended purpose of the technology was. They used, for example, the great example of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge up in Washington State and other examples. And boy, did that grab me, Eric. And I thought, I think I might be more interested in the application of technology than the design of technology. So I took a course in communication, not knowing that the communication program at the University of Illinois at that time was as legendary as the engineering program. And suddenly I had this phenomenal professor who was telling me about communication in ways that I had no idea you could study, learn about, and apply communication. And it fit with ham radio too. So I ended up switching into the field of communication. And one of the first things I learned, which has greatly affected my view of the hobby, that communication is much more important than sending and receiving messages. It's all about building community, or in some cases with bad communication, destroying community. And so I began to look at the hobby in terms of a community building hobby, and saw it as very important kind of fraternity for people, especially for men. And I don't say that in some sexist way or gender preference way or anything, but the fact is that the communication research shows men are less likely to reach outside themselves and build strong interpersonal relationships than women are. And so I think ham radio has helped men create fraternities like ham radio clubs and, ham fests and big ham fests and groups that are into different phases of the hobby in really some spectacular ways.
Don't men need structure in order to kind of hang their social relationships on?
Yeah, exactly. Men are dependent on women to some extent, and I don't mean this just with spouses, but they're dependent on women in general in society to provide a lot of the structure. Most importantly in domestic life, but also in things like schools and certain kinds of professions, like the health profession. The health profession is an interesting one, and I've looked at the research on this. It hangs together to a large extent by the women, particularly the nurses who keep it going.
Right, they provide that foundation for care that wouldn't come from doctors, for example.
Exactly.
Because I don't think doctors are trained to be caregivers. They're trained to be, with all due respect to any doctors listening, they're trained to be technicians in the area of specialty that they're in.
Right.
So they provide the intervention, but they don't provide that care that's needed along the way. You know, I think every company's this way too. I think perhaps you can confirm this, but behind every great CEO is his executive secretary, who may be a woman, who's been doing it for years and knows exactly what thing to put in front of him at the point that he's making some kind of decision or something like that.
Right. I just met with the president of a college a couple of days ago. He had contacted me, knew I was going to be in the area and wanted to meet with me, and I went in and we had a wonderful discussion about a variety of things, including the future of higher education and so forth. And he's very interested in my views of communication as a campus phenomenon, what makes for really good education, including teaching. And so we talked about this, and we wrapped up our conversation, and he said, well, let's stay in touch. I said, great. Give me the name and contact information for your assistant, because I know that your assistant will follow up and things will go well if I have that contact.
And, of course, he laughed and gave you the information?
Yeah, he said, you're right, and then he wrote it out for me.
Do you think that we're conditioned that way in society, or do you think that that's something from your studies that's kind of just natural?
Yeah, so as an academic, I always try to be a little bit careful on this, and I would say it's probably a combination of things. We're finding out more and more how much that we thought was led by genetics is part of cultural formation, and how much we thought was cultural formation has a genetic component. This is really a wonderful time to be alive, and the research on communication on that issue is amazing. How much, let's say, are your children communicating like you and your spouse or like a sibling, and how much are peer groups shaping the communication of our children and the like. Eric, what I'd like to do is a little turn in the discussion here. I'm still back at the University of Illinois, and I'm beginning to study communication quite seriously. And they invite me to get a master's degree, and they invite me to get a doctoral degree. And so I go to the university to study engineering, and I end up with a PhD in communication from the same school that I got my undergrad master's from, all by invitation, because of what professors saw in me, the gifts that they saw, and not what I saw of myself. I had very low self-esteem, but to encourage people. So one of the things I like to do in the hobby, especially when I'm on HF or when I'm involved in local ham clubs, is to encourage people, encourage them in the hobby with their lives, help them out, help them build antennas, fix equipment, whatever, because I think that kind of encouragement is so important in the hobby. Another thing that I learned through my graduate work was that there is what I will call a spiritual dimension to human communication. This will require a little bit of explanation. Anybody who's interested in it more can go to Amazon and look up my name, Quentin Schultze, or go to my website, quintinschultze.com, and see some of the books and articles and all that I've written on this.
Quinn, I'll have all those links in the show notes page.
That's great. So here's the thing. The whole idea that you and I, Eric, are able to communicate when we are not in geographic proximity. In other words, you and I are not right next to each other using our basic forms of speaking and listening. But we can do this across geographic space, through geographic space. We can conquer geographic space. That is a phenomenal thing. It is a spiritual thing. It's like people talk about prayer, this whole idea of prayer, that you can pray to a God you believe in, and you don't see that God, and the God is not necessarily right there with you in geographic space, at least not visible. That's a religious thing, and yet it's also part of the human quest in order to overcome the limitations of time and space, in order to commune with one another, communicate with one another. And that has always, always fascinated me, and it's got me deeply into studying the history of Western religions, particularly the ancient Hebrew faith, and then kind of anchored into that, the Christian faith, where you see some of the elements and thinking about communication across space and through time in the sacred scriptures and in the theologies of those religions.
But do you think, Quin, based on your experience, that our ability to have a meaningful conversation that transcends the time and space, because I'm in Israel and you're in the Carolinas, is because of our training? That if we weren't used to face-to-face communication and communication that we are used to doing every single day, that we in fact wouldn't be able to have a meaningful conversation over the internet, over the radio, or anything like that without some training?
Now, Eric, you're really getting into some interesting and deep stuff. We are, by our, I'll call it this, our createdness, our nature as Homo sapiens, however this came about, we are different than other creatures in this particular quest. And so I've looked long and hard at communication among other creatures, and you can't find anything like this quest to really overcome time and space. And it becomes by its nature, it becomes a technological quest. So here's an interesting thing. That Greek word, techne, that technology comes from, actually has its origins in the tool of speech. So we can think of speech, speaking and hearing, and everything that emanates from that, including the development of writing and reading, and later on electronic media, and then digital media. We can think of all of that as part of this human quest. And ham radio comes along at a certain time in history, and it anchors itself in that. But all hams, I believe, though they may never have thought about it, have this kind of quest to overcome time and space in some way with tools, techne.
So unlike other mammals that need the visual communication, the eye-to-eye communication in order to understand, whether I'm the dominant or the submissive side of the conversation, human beings are completely different in terms of how we communicate ideas or strength or power or things like that.
Yeah, we are different. And it has to do significantly with the level of symbolic capacity. So the symbol is something that stands for something else. And so we create things like words. So we create the word radio, and then we have a general notion of what a radio is, or we can use it to refer to a specific radio, but it's not the radio itself. It's a symbol. So the symbolic capacity of human beings is absolutely extraordinary. And the deepest part of it has to do with metaphor. These metaphors that we create to use, and there's a lot of them in radio that we use as metaphor to talk about something that is not so tangible. The ether. In the early days of electronic communication through space, they would talk about communicating through the ether, and the ether became a great symbol, and it as a metaphor too. And then it became really important again in the development of the telegraph, and then once again with the development of the internet. And so a lot of the early books on the internet were talking about communicating through the ether, and it's this kind of mysterious thing that messages are out there somewhere going from place to place, even though we can't exactly put our finger on them, but they're out there. And of course, with digital modes, it's fascinating. You have all these bits and bytes, these things that somehow are put out there. They're decoded and then recoded and put back together, and they have meaning at the other end. It may be a meaning that somebody misinterprets, but so we are a spectacular species, and I think the development of advanced forms of communication are representative of that, Eric.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and Company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Quinn, this is the first time I think I've had this kind of conversation about this, but I can remember as a teenager in the 70s, I was unable to operate HF because of the HOA that happened to exist at the time. I think I might have been in the only HOA neighborhood in the country at that time. But I was on VHF and UHF, and what was interesting to me, and I thought a lot about it, that if I was operating on, say, 146.46 or 146.43, and there were regular people, there were communities on these channels, that these channels kind of became a place in space. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It was as real as the park down the street in terms of a place, and that's the way that we all thought about it. It was quite remarkable that it would feel that way, and frankly, it still feels that way, the local repeater, or I guess even in the HF, if there's a watering hole that people hang out on 80 meters or 40 meters, it becomes a territory.
It does, yeah. It becomes a community in and of itself. And by the way, that word community and the word communication stem from the same Latin, communitas, meaning essentially to make common. And so we make common culture, common societies, we make common communities. You're absolutely right. And we don't think about it, just like you may not have thought about it too much in the past and may not have thought about it. You had the urges as a child, but you didn't have the language or understanding to look at that later in life. So when I consult with organizations about their communication, I say to them up front, you know, what I'm going to be looking at is how you form and deform community through communication and miscommunication and mal, meaning evil communication in your organization. And at first they look at me like I'm some crazy guy from outer space. But in fact, that's what we're all doing all the time. And I think whether you look at, you know, HF, UHF, VHF, if you look at the areas in bandwidth where that so-called ether is, that human beings are communicating, what you're seeing there is much of it's driven by an impulse to conquer the space and time and to form community through space and time.
So this explains then, Quinn, that why there are people who absolutely feel that a spot on 80 meters or 40 meters is their spot. It's become their real estate on the air, because that's where their community meets on a regular basis. And if you tell them to move up 5 or down 5, then you're actually telling them to move across the street.
Exactly. I was at a coffee shop here in the area in Hendersonville, North Carolina, the other day with my wife, and they have some nice, comfortable sofas there. And so we grabbed one. We were sitting together enjoying a great cup of coffee. By the way, Gene Shepard, K2ORS, who's kind of a legendary ham, and was the primary writer of the movie A Christmas Story, was a friend of mine. I'm actually working on a book now on that film based on his understanding of communication and community. But at any rate, we were there at this call. Oh, I was going to say to you, he said to me once, Gene Shepard said to me once, you know, Quinn, he said, whenever you have a really good cup of coffee, you know there must be a God. You know, and you think about it, and I say, whenever you have a fantastic QSO, you know it's something beyond yourself. Whenever you communicate across space and time in a way you never thought could be done, wow, it's an awesome thing. And it seems like it's beyond what we ourselves could do on our own strength or merit or ability. And so I'm at the coffee shop, and my wife in there, and then this other couple that lives in the area sits across from us in individual chairs, not in a sofa. And I start up a conversation, which I like to do. It's like a QSO in the coffee shop. These people were from the Chicago area. I was from the Chicago area region. We were talking about different things and so on. And I said, do you like this coffee shop? Yeah, we come all the way across town to come here because this is our favorite place. And he explained why. And So for me, it's a QSO going, and we're forming some community here. But and he said to me at one point, he said, we usually come here and sit where you two are seated. And I thought, oh, boy, I thought that's interesting. We're taking their seats. So when my wife and I left, we went outside, got in our car, and looked up in the glass of this coffee shop. And sure enough, they got up and changed their seats. So, yes, a certain frequency, like let's say 7,200 on 40 meters, there are people who believe that that is their frequency. Or if you get on 75 meters at night, there are many, many frequencies there. You have to be careful if you try to start up a QSO or call a CQ, because somebody's going to say, hey, my community is on that. We have space and time anchored in that frequency.
Every time I hear about, for example, commercial entities absorbing amateur radio spectrum for use, perhaps because maybe we didn't use it enough and so therefore we've lost it. But honestly, it feels like a real loss. It feels like suffering a financial or real estate loss. Does that seem normal?
Yes. Let me try to explain it this way, Eric. There is what we could call ground-up communication and top-down or sky-down communication. There is communication that is organic and it springs up from people in their everyday lives. And then there is communication that is designed and controlled and patterned by those who have access to and control of certain technologies. And so we spend all of our lives in between, in this middle ground, Middle Earth, to use a Tolkien metaphor there. And it can get quite complicated at any one time or another. People will often say to me, with respect to the internet or cyberspace, as they call it, another metaphor, that it's so great because anybody can communicate with anyone. Well, in theory, that's true. But in fact, when you have dominant companies and dominant technologies, and technology including the software, that are the places that people have to naturally go to do that, then the way people do it is going to be controlled somewhat or influenced by those organizations. Here's an interesting point. One of the first, I think it was the second academic journal peer-reviewed article I wrote with a co-author in about 1975 was about the growth of CB radio in the United States. What was happening back then was that CB radio was absolutely taking off, and people were buying CB radios left and right, putting them in their cars. The truckers were big into it. It had become a phenomenon. There was music about this phenomenon that people were listening to, especially on country music stations in the U.S., and country music is the most popular kind of music in the United States with so many stations. And there were movies about it. And so a colleague and I looked at this and interviewed a lot of people, and what we discovered was that because CB radios had gotten so cheap and so many people were installing them and the FCC was not really regulating, that it was creating all kinds of new forms of community. Local in community, so people within maybe a 5 to 10 mile range, depending on their antennas, would be forming CB radio related communities in their areas. And truckers now had a new form of community as they would communicate on the road, and then they would stop together in different truck stops to talk things over and so on. So you always have this from the ground up form of communication where human beings are using technology in their own ways to form a community, and then you have the top down. A lot of the discourse in the public media today about Twitter as a technology is interesting to me because Twitter started off as kind of a public or democratic platform for individuals to be able to have democratic discourse with other individuals. And very rapidly, you had certain people and certain organizations who were the dominant players. And most of the communication was about these dominant players sending things to be received by other large numbers of people, not so much about democratic discourse.
One of the things that you mentioned with the CB radio growth, I mean, we used to claim that amateur radio was the first social network. Would you say that CB radio growth became the second social network then? It's
very difficult to define social network because I've defined communication in terms of community, which is a kind of network. And so then you have to go back and you say, what are really the origins And what I have studied over my life to a large extent is the history and development of, and the sociology of the growth of forms of communication and attendant forms of community. So social networks in that sense have always been around. Now, if we move into the so-called modern world, let's say the 19th century with the development of the telegraph, we have interesting social networks formed among telegraph operators.
Right.
Not in their professional capacity to pass along messages, but in their own communication with their own fists, to use that term that we like to use for your CW operation, forming great social networks. So in an electronic form, I would say that was the first real social network.
So what you're saying is that the telegraph operators might have been communicating with each other if there was no traffic to pass.
Oh, they were all the time. Yeah, we know that from the research. They did that all the time and they were the ones that knew what was going on in other places as they would share the news with one another. And so the telegraph really became the first technology to, through the gossip among them, distribute news.
So then you had the wire news agencies. Maybe that sparked that idea, or that's how they came into being then.
That's exactly how they came into being.
Like UPI, API.
Right. Yeah, they decided, hey, what these telegraph operators are doing is something that we can do profitably. But we need the wires, we need the professionals who can do the code, and it became phenomenally important in the development of the telegraph. Well, there have been a number of books written now looking at the development of the telegraph in parallel to the development of the internet, and I think to some extent there's some truth in that. One of the good books on that is called The Victorian Internet, about the rise of the telegraph. And the telegraph actually led to the development of a lot of hams, or people who became interested in wireless, as we call it, wireless communication as well in the early days.
Did you stay in academia in the quote-unquote ivory tower, or did you find a place to go outside of academia in order to apply your trade? And did ham radio play a part in that as you went along doing that?
Yeah, another great question. You're a good interviewer, Eric. So I have always had 1 foot in academe and 1 foot outside of academe in other realms. Businesses, nonprofits, consulting very significantly on a variety of things, owning parts of businesses, developing new businesses. I early on developed a publishing company to do what I call quick response books. So if you know there's a book coming out in the near future that's going to be very popular and copies, pre-release copies of that book are available, I would hire someone who knows that topic well to write a response book and have that book out through digital means within weeks of the time that the original book would actually come out. Did a lot of early work on e-books as a development. I have an interesting e-book on Kindle book about Gutenberg because there's so much misunderstanding. In fact, if people go to my website, which you'll have on your site, Eric, they can subscribe to my email list there, and if they do, they can download different free items, one of which is that Gutenberg e-book. I can't remember if I've got it free on Amazon or not. But Gutenberg had a notion of what he wanted to accomplish that was very different from the way popular historians have written up Gutenberg. I don't want to say anything more about that or I'll give it away, but I was involved early on in the internet in creating a company selling high-end watches online, and that was very, very successful. I've created, as I say, a range of companies, and one of my other internet projects is working with some people as a nonprofit to put the Bible on the internet early on, and it's called the Bible Gateway now. And it has the Bible in multiple languages. It has multiple commentaries and all. By the time, I think after about 3 years in development of that particular website was in the top 10 traffic of all websites worldwide on the internet. And it was an interesting project because once we started looking at other languages and which languages to put on and which are the most popular languages in the world and all, so it was really putting the most popular book of all time online. A very interesting project. I could talk about many other projects I've been part of, but the fact of the matter is that I've maintained my sanity as an academician doing theoretical and scholarly work, and I've done a lot of it by having practical outlets. And with ham radio, I approach all of my ham radio work from the perspective of my academic discipline. I'm always thinking about who's communicating with whom for what end, what community is being formed or deformed, and how can I make a contribution there? So I've been a lifetime member of the ARRL, the American Radio Relay League, since probably 1982 or so. I don't know, way back. And I've always been interested about how you can form a community of ham radio operators and what does that take. And so when I read QST magazine or look at the emails from people or speeches done by the ARRL president or CEO or whatever, I'm always thinking about what are they doing through communication to enhance the community of ham radio, or maybe not to enhance. It's like a sickness, Eric. I can't get it out of my craw.
I have the same problem, Quin.
I forgot to mention I worked in radio for a while. I love radio as a medium, or audio as it is now with podcasts and so forth. And I also worked in television. I did film and TV series reviews for a so-called superstation in Chicago, WGN, that was one of the first stations that was on satellite. And that was an interesting experience. I did that for about 4 or 5 years, and getting responses from people in other parts of the hemisphere, interpreting what I had said and all, really showed me how tenuous communication can be.
When you were working in radio and television, were you a personality on the air?
Yeah, in radio I was not. I was selling advertising and writing advertising for other people to produce. And then with television, I was the one that was the so-called talent. I actually wrote my own TV and film reviews and then delivered them in front of the camera. I can't remember how long those reviews were. There may be some exist out there somewhere on YouTube or something, probably like 3 minutes. You know, it used to be a popular thing, Eric, on TV stations where they would have a local who would sometimes be standing out in front of the theater talking about the new movies that were coming out that day.
Do you remember there was a pair of film reviewers that were very popular nationwide, but I thought they came out of Chicago?
Yeah, they did. Siskel and Ebert. Yeah, and Roger Ebert went to the University of Illinois, where I went at the same time. And I'm trying to remember, he was just before me or just after me. And then he would come down to the university periodically, and they have an award that they give down there in his honor. Yeah, they were very good at it. They started the thumbs up, thumbs down kind of thing.
What do you think made them good reviewers? I mean, what about either their personalities or their education made them so good at what they were doing?
Yeah, Ebert was a brilliant film historian, and he could relate films to previous films and understand why they were written the way they were, how they were directed, the influence that directors had on the film, and so on. And then Siskel was kind of his troublemaker. Yeah, he was on there to throw out comments and kind of perturb Ebert a little bit. And sometimes it got out of control. And there were a couple of times in their relationship where they stopped talking personally, which I thought was kind of funny. They're in the communication business, and they can't communicate. So they had a whole shtick going, with the two of them, and they were quite good about that.
The tension in communication was probably what made them interesting.
Yeah. In the communication research about media, when you ask what is media bias, and by the way, I'll apply this to ham radio too. What is ham radio bias that attracts people to particular ham radio operators or frequencies or events and the like? There are two fundamental human biases. The first bias is conflict. Wherever there's conflict, and it doesn't have to be bad conflict, it can be good conflict, like which is a better technology, and people arguing about that. I remember in the early days of single sideband, the tremendous really fun arguments we had about the difference between AM and sideband, and AMers calling sideband, a bunch of Daffy Ducks, and that medium would never go anywhere, and so on. So conflict is one thing. And then the other is persona or personality. And people are attracted to certain kinds of personalities, interesting personalities. In the history of ham radio, one of the most interesting personalities who generated a lot of conflict was a guy named Wayne Green, who put out 73 magazine. And he had a column where he would go different people, and he would take on the ARRL, and he could be quite nasty. A lot of it was in fun because what he was trying to do was to create a bigger audience for his magazine. And the biggest bias in the mass media today, if you look at radio and television and the so-called cable news channels and all, has to do with conflict and persona and how different groups and tribes and political parties and so forth use those two for their own ends.
Does ham radio have a culture, Quin? And if it does, what is that culture?
Yeah, so what is the culture of ham radio? It has multiple cultures, and anyone who tries to come in and by the way, the definition of a culture, the most widely accepted definition from anthropology, is a way of life. A culture is a way of life. It's something that human beings have cultivated. And you think of agriculture, and then there's human culture. So there is a culture around HF and the kind of communication in general, and on sideband and HF, there's a culture around DXing. There's a culture around new digital modes. There's a culture of ham radio clubs. And we're seeing an interesting resurgence in ham radio clubs as a way of forming ham radio culture. There have been codes of operation that have been tried to be part of the general culture of ham radio, but those have been to some extent forgotten or not used. So it's multiple cultures, but I think there is a fundamental culture that has to do with the fun of communicating across time and space through using different technologies for the love of it. That is, as amateurs, for the love of it. And that's how at base I would define the culture.
As amateur radio operators, do we have a calling?
I think each of these cultures, Eric, has a kind of calling connected to it. I mean, there is a calling in the sense of innovation, doing innovation, but of course that's not idiosyncratic to hams. That exists throughout society in entrepreneurial efforts of all kinds. There's also a cultural dimension of innovation for the love of it in ham radio, which has been there from the very beginning. And my colleague and I, in our YouTube channel, Ham Radio Perspectives, have started looking at the history of this, how it is that hams early on looked at what they were doing with no profit motive whatsoever as a way of benefiting humankind. And that is a remarkable thing. It reminds me a lot of what happens today in the software industries that are open source, or in, let's say, websites like Wikipedia, where people contribute to things. So you get on a ham radio QSO on one of my favorite bands is 18 megs, and I love the people on there. It's not crowded, and you get into a conversation, and somebody is suddenly teaching somebody else about how to build a particular antenna that they have built, or the way they've modified an antenna, and how they got rid of interference and this and that. And so there's a self-education component in it too, I think.
Do you find that the tenor of our ham radio communications has changed through the years?
I don't think it's fundamentally changed. Now, I talk to a lot of hams who tell me that there is a lot of nastiness, particularly on the HF bands. And there is out there on certain frequencies. It comes about now and again. But I remember that back when I started in 1965 or 66 in there listening just before I got my ticket. There were incredible conflicts among people on 75 meter AM in particular, and there were people who were calling CQ. There was an expression, call CQ, and they would say no kids, no lids, Class A only. Class A being an advanced level of license. And I thought to myself, what in the world is this? So I don't think it's any worse. It's part of human nature for people to get upset about things and have conflicts about things.
So for us hams, then, we're really a reflection of the larger society in terms of the attitudes and prejudices and other things that we bring with us to ham radio?
Exactly. There's a great term in the history of ancient rhetoric by the Greeks for this. It's called synecdoche. Synecdoche, S-Y-N. You can look it up. Synecdoche means the part that stands for the whole. And in rhetoric, or let's say public communication, I would say to some extent ham radio is a part that can indeed stand for the whole.
Can we hams do something better to communicate with each other?
I think where we need the most improvement in ham radio is with the local ham radio clubs. And so my colleague in our YouTube channel did 3 or 4 videos on this, and we got some great responses from ham radio clubs that are doing splendid things. And so I think to some extent the future of the hobby has to do not with the technology per se, but with how well hams, through their local communication, their local clubs, the local repeaters and so forth, cultivate a very hospitable, warm environment or culture where those who might run across people who are hams are invited in and encouraged and mentored along. I think local communication is really more difficult these days everywhere, and part of that has to do with the social media. I know as a college educator that college students are just not very, college-age students are not very good local in-person communicators right now because they spend so much time in social media.
Right. I can see them as they're walking on the streets, and I almost hit them as they step off the curb, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, everybody has their face in their phones, but they're not paying attention to the bigger things like my car.
Right. And I've talked to colleagues who teach journalism at universities, and they tell me one of the most difficult things is getting students to go out and do a live in-person interview of a source for a news story. They all want to try to do something through their cell phone, not by calling. They're even scared of calling, but by sending out a text or maybe an email. And so this is, again, the synecdoche. It's what's happening in the hobby, I think, is represented in the larger society as well.
I think you're right, Quinn. I'm thinking about it as you're speaking that while I think ham radio is as exciting, or maybe more exciting than it's ever been, maybe because of the huge spectrum of technology that we have available, and of course the internet complementing that because we can share so quickly and innovate also so quickly, that they're really deck chairs on the Titanic, right? If we don't figure out a way to welcome people into the hobby, to make them part of our community, then at a certain point the ship just goes down.
Right. I was really delighted to see that the ARRL and QST magazine now has a column devoted to reporting on and presumably promoting local clubs and finding out which clubs are doing what and helping others learn from them. So we need to attend to communication at all levels in each of our lives. And the local is taking it on the chin now because it's so easy to communicate afar with these technologies that we carry around in our pockets or in our cars. But if we don't attend to what you and I are doing every day with the hospitality, then we do get into trouble. By the way, hospitality in the history of communication studies, my field, is one of the most important concepts. To be hospitable means essentially to make room in our heads and in our hearts, in our minds and our hearts, for those who are different from us or outside of us. And it has been a hugely important practice throughout history. And you find those societies that are hospitable tend to be societies that grow. They are open to newcomers, and they listen. Listening is one of the great marks of hospitality. And, when I'm on the air and on HF and somebody will say to me, well, I just listen, I don't talk much. And they say that as if that's not important, but actually listening to other hams in and of itself is a wonderful thing. It's a gift to be able to do. And listening in the ancient Hebrew context, now this is really where the most influential definition of listening comes from in the Western world, the ancient Hebrew context, in what Christians call the Old Testament, or we could call the Hebrew Bible.
Or we could call it the Torah, and for those of us that read it every week.
The Torah, right. A lot of great Western wisdom comes from that. I mean, and about communication. So listening is, and I'll give you the Hebrew word for it too, is intimate understanding of something. So you don't understand something superficially, but you get to understand it at root. You really understand it. I'm going to take this even further. You stand under it. You let it overtake you so that you really know it. You're intimate with it. That's the best kind of listening. And the Hebrew term for this is yada, Y-A-D-A, and the accent on the second A, yada. And so when, let's say, a Jewish comedian today, Seinfeld, let's give Seinfeld as an example. Jerry Seinfeld is doing a routine, and then he says, yada, 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 yada. What he's doing there is calling through the Yiddish on that ancient term, yada, to know, and what he's saying is, you know, as if you don't have to say anything more. We all know. Well, that's the kind of communication, ironically, Eric, that gets us into trouble, where we assume we know.
The Hebrew word to hear is shamati, I hear. It doesn't translate well to English, as you're saying, because it also means I listen. I'm not only listening, but I'm hearing. So it has a deeper understanding.
Yeah, and that deeper understanding has to do with truly understanding. So you can hear what someone says and not understand them.
But some of these words at their base have a number of meanings that, can also be quite spiritual. Around, say, Shema or Shamati or Ani Shomea. So I listen, I hear, I heard. It goes exactly as you're saying. It goes much deeper than, what you think the word is.
Yeah, you're exactly. And so, sometimes we get a little bit of a sense of that when somebody will say, do you hear me? Because they don't mean just, did you hear the sound? Did you understand me? And that yada, to go back to that a little bit, or as you developed it, of course, is also the word that's used to know intimately in a physical sense.
Yes, you have to be careful sometimes when you use these words, especially if you're asking for something in the store and you use the word wrong. It's very possible that people will start laughing.
Yeah, that you are coming on to them, as we would say today.
If I said, Ani yodeat, I know you, if I said that to any woman other than my wife, then I probably would be slapped.
There you go. When I think about the hobby in my own life, then, again, to come full circle on this, Eric, I think about the fact that I can get on my favorite bands, which happen to be the HF bands, my favorite mode, which now happens to be single sideband, and I can have conversations with people, some of whom I know, and I can further develop those communities, and with some people that I don't know, that are fascinating, interesting people, and learn a lot and feel like I have been blessed by that connection. Like I had a QSO a few months back with a guy, I think it was on 40 meters, who commanded a submarine, a U.S. submarine. That was a fantastic conversation. I had another one with a guy that spent years with the FBI and had as one of his closest friends one of the top writers of fiction in the U.S., actually in the world, that writes military fiction. And I think, how many hobbies can you develop this kind of communication? Not many.
I must say that the reason that I continue to do the QSO Today podcast week after week is because I get to have these amazing, like I'm doing with you right now, Quinn, these amazing QSOs with ham radio operators. Unfortunately, not on the radio, but I get to spend an hour or more every week with the smartest people in the world I've ever met. So it's an amazing thing.
It's a gift.
It's a gift, and hopefully the gift keeps giving. What's the current rig?
Yeah, we moved into a condo a couple years ago, and I sold off Collins, Kenwood, Drake, Tentec. I sold off all kinds of equipment because of limited space. I ended up with two rigs, a Kenwood TS5 590 SG, and then I had an an Elecraft K3, but then I sold off the Elecraft and bought a 7300, IC 7300 around the time that they came out. Wanted to test it. Normally I buy used equipment because my view of what the cost of a rig is always the difference between what I pay for it and what I can sell it for. So I will buy used equipment and try it out. If I like it, keep it. Otherwise, get rid of it. But I have limited space now. So I have the 7300 going. I sold off the 590 SG. I'm looking at picking up a different, maybe truly all-digital rig, like an Anon or something. And then I have a few amplifiers sitting around, too. I have a couple of Elecraft amplifiers. I don't use amplification much. To be honest with you, I don't feel like I need it. My current antenna, and I experiment a lot with antennas, even though I'm in a condo association, I've HOA, I've got permission to use wire antenna, so I can't put a tower up with a Yagi or something. But I do a lot with end feds, with dipoles, with slopers. Right now I have an off-center fed that I built from scratch up at about 55 feet that I'm experimenting with, altering how high the ends of it are and how low, and running some tests with that. Also seeing what kind of bandwidth I can get out of it by changing the lengths of it.
Do they allow you to put up a pole to hold the antenna up in the middle, or?
Yeah, I use trees. We're right next to our property is some trees that are part of the common area of the association. So I pull stuff up in the trees there. I did have a pole for a while, just like a 25-foot pole coming off of our deck, and then I was doing that. But that was not as good as the trees. I can hoist stuff up in the trees pretty well.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. So the current rig is the IC7300.
Yeah.
For the most part, and you got rid of vintage 70s radios, mostly 60s and 70s radios.
Yeah, and some newer stuff too. And then I also had a, what is the number of the rig that's the upgrade from the 7300?
The IC7610 is the upgrade.
Yeah, that's 7610. So I bought a used 7610 and tried that out for a few months. And I did not like the control system on it. I thought it was not very intuitive. I liked the rig, terrific receive. I liked the dual receivers and everything. But I didn't like how, to me, it seemed to be unintuitive. I'm very much into intuitive interfaces. And again, this comes from my background in engineering, moving over to the application of technology and how user-friendly things are. So just as a matter of personal choice, I decided to get rid of that rig, and now I'm looking at some other rigs.
But you have to admit the IC7300, for the value, the price and the value, is pretty amazing.
It is.
When you're looking at used radios that are $700-800.
Right, and how the used 7300s have kept their value. My colleague and I on Ham Radio Perspectives did a video on, I think it's called something like 10 reasons why the 7300 is so popular, or how the 7300 has impacted the hobby, I think is the way we put it. And we always work history, technology, sociology, and all into our videos, trying to be a little bit different, not to just do stuff on the technology per se. There are plenty of people that do great stuff, better, I think, than what we could do on that. And I think the 7300 represents a shift in the history of HF operating that will prove itself to be very significant. And here's what I would say is the number one reason, and that is the visual component of the operation. Any technology that uses more human senses is going to be more impactful to human beings in the formation of the community. It's just the way we're made, which is one of the reasons why communication in person, where you have so many quote-unquote modes going at once, is so important.
So you're saying that the touch screen, the waterfall display, your fingers on the knobs, so it's tactile, it's visual, and obviously it's audible if you've got your speaker turned on or your headphones plugged into it. So it kind of captivates all of your senses.
Right, and that visual sense of having that band scope up there, although there are other technologies, of course, that did that in the past, but not so inexpensively, easily. That is an interesting one in terms of what we talked about earlier, space and time. So what you're looking at across that band spread is in time, different space, band space, and what's happening there. And I recall the first really good receiver I got as a ham operator was an SX-111, ham band only, to replace that S85. And when I would tune up and down the band as a kid with a pretty good visual memory, and by the way, we tend to remember more visually than in any other way. When I tune up and down the band, I would see where a station was, hear it briefly, and then move on. And then I could go back to that frequency. I couldn't see that frequency, but I could go back to it if I could remember what the frequency was. And so what we have with something like the 7300 is this space and time out there in a way that we continue to see and we can move around in or play in a visual way. That's very powerful.
Right, well, it's like flying over the neighborhood, right? You can see all the houses.
Exactly.
I think that's why it's so captivating. I've always wanted to have, and I do have, a spectrum analyzer on my workbench because from that same experience that I wanted to see what was in the band and where else I was in the band if I had a dirty transmitter, for example. And that's exactly the user experience that I get from the band scope on the 7300 is it lets me see what's happening in the neighborhood.
Yeah, there's a visual dimension different visual dimensions to the hobby that we don't much talk about. Another one is the aesthetic aspects of the equipment, the aesthetic, or we could say artistic, the exterior design elements in particular, not the operating design elements per se. Very, very important. And we have all of us built into us by our createdness a sense of what is good looking and what is not. Now, there's a cultural screen that runs over that, but when I was a grad student at the University of Illinois, I worked with one of the guys who developed the field of psycholinguistics. And the idea we had at that time was that if we took certain words that are common, let's say the word God across many different cultures, or boy or girl or whatever, we took those words and we created a way of measuring the meaning of those words in different cultures. This became what's called the semantic differential, and it's used in a lot of studies now, but we developed it back then. We found, looking at many different cultures, that a lot of these words, the meanings were more or less the same across cultures, across widely different cultures in different parts of the world, including what made something beautiful, let's say. So what you have with rigs is a sense of beauty or lack of beauty that's pretty consistent. And you can even talk about what is a classic. We talk about classic music, Eric. We can talk about what is a classic ham rig. And my colleague and I say that probably the Collins S line, in terms of design, is the most classic, the most enduring through time. And all kinds of other manufacturers began knockoffs, particularly Heathkit, of the classic design. So we don't talk about these sorts of things often in the hobby, but they are there.
So you're saying that the Collins form factor was actually adopted by all the other radio companies that made radios afterwards. Because you mentioned, for example, Drake or Swan or later the Japanese manufacturers. But up until they all went microelectronics, they were all pretty much the same size.
Yes, and imitative. There were other classic designs. The Hammerland equipment, much of that a kind of classic design. We talk about some of those artistic elements in the video too. But I will say that one thing, we got some very nasty mail on hams, and not to be nasty, but they can disagree with you vehemently. One of the things we say in the video, we try to say it politely, but is that what happens when you start to get the development of the Asian or principally the Japanese rigs is that they start copying each other, partly because they're running about the same size with the same kinds of components or boards in them, but Also, there's a lack of creativity in the visual development of those. And so I think that there's actually been a decrease in the breadth and the depth of quality of the exterior visual form of amateur radio equipment because of the rise of the Japanese equipment.
It seems to me that Japanese manufacturers rely on a supply chain that will give them maybe a lot of the same stuff in terms that will affect the ergonomic or the look of the radio.
There you have it.
Cars work the same way. It used to be you couldn't tell the difference between a Datsun and a Toyota because they were using, in those days, and they may still be using, what were called Zaibatsu trading organizations. So essentially you had the big name on the car, but the pieces were all coming from lots of little shops, many of them the same suppliers to all of the big manufacturers.
Exactly.
What do you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is now, Quinn?
I don't know. I guess I would flip that around and talk about the opportunities. I mean, I talked about the one challenge in terms of the local clubs, and I think that is a challenge that right now we need to address pretty seriously, including getting younger people involved in the clubs in some way, getting more women involved in the clubs, because I think the women will do a better job of, I hate to say this, of running the clubs and making them more hospitable. But beyond that, what I see is opportunity. All of the hams eventually either innovate or they co-opt existing technologies and media forms and use them in novel ways for novel purposes. And so any kind of communication opportunity that's out there, hams can have a role in. They just have to look at what's going on and see where the needs are. One of the things I like to do with my college students who are going to be out looking for jobs, and they say, gee, how do I find a job? I say, well, do you know where the needs are? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, let's do it this way. I want you to go talk to 3 managers or CEOs of smaller companies in this area and ask them one question. What are their biggest needs? Now, I tell you from experience on this, and it's kind of promoting my own field, but one of the needs they will talk about is communication related, and there may be a number of those, like communicating with employees or employee morale or the like. But if we as hams pay attention to what's going on around us in our worlds, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our governments, and how the communication needs expose themselves there are often opportunities for hams to be involved. And so I see the hobby more as an opportunity-laden way of life than I do a problematic way of life.
Oh, that's so interesting, Quinn. I look at ham radio as a training ground for life. You may remember from the 50s, remember the movie Forbidden Planet?
Sure.
So it had the Krell. The Krell were this race of technicians, technical priests, as it were, who came to understand that they didn't understand their technology anymore because they just assume it worked. And I keep thinking that we're at this point in our industry, and I'm talking in general, but I'm not talking, obviously, we have titans of industry that seem to know everything about technology, but I don't think that's the majority of people anymore. And I think the majority of people don't understand how anything works. And that what ham radio does, and maybe this is why I'm so passionate about it and why I'm so passionate about, teaching it through the expo and the other things I'm doing, ham radio is the one hobby that unites a whole bunch of different kinds of communications, technology, basic hand tools. It takes the whole ball of wax, and you can draw from, as you said, from all of these different areas in order to gain some expertise. And in doing that, you end up with some understanding of how things work. And I don't think there's anything like it. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think it's a Renaissance hobby, and it, by its nature, the way it developed historically, it includes parts of anything that you could imagine. So, I think in terms of university disciplines, let's say, or academic disciplines, and I can tell you that every academic discipline touches ham radio, and I really mean that. And I've met a lot of hams who are professors or grad students or whatever at a lot of schools, not just in my field of communication. And it's amazing to me how they can relate what they're doing to this, what we consider to be a hobby or an amateur, something we do for the love of it, It's one of the most spectacular hobbies there is. But getting people interested in it should be a passion, a goal of all of us, and to keep it up, not to keep others away or not to remain silent about it, but to toot our horns in wonderful ways. Anytime people ask me now what my hobbies are, I say, well, I've got two of them, and I'll talk with you about both of them briefly. One of them is bird watching, an avid birder, and we can talk about that and the whole culture around that. And then I say the other one is ham radio. And the first thing that people say to me is, oh, do people still do that? My uncle who passed away was a ham. Like that. They have no clue that the thing still exists.
I hear that all the time.
Hey, this has been a great QSO, Eric.
I'm having a lot of fun here. It's going over the time. Most of the QSO Today listeners have smaller lawns than other podcasts, but I've really enjoyed this. Do you have advice, Quin, for newer returning hams that you would give?
Yeah, connect with other hams, if possible, in person, and form community. And the local community being first and foremost, and you will enjoy the hobby more. You will have colleagues that will work with you and help solve problems, and you will find reward by serving others. Each of us in the hobby to the others in the hobby is to be a good neighbor. And I think that's why we're around. And avoid getting into the situation where the hobby becomes just an isolating thing, isolating you from others. And that can happen with all technologies. They can isolate us as well as bring us together.
Quin, I've had such a great QSO with you. I'm really glad that we went down some of the rabbit holes that we went. With that, I want to thank you so much for coming on and wish you 73.
Hey, thanks so much, Eric. Thanks for all you do for the hobby, including this oral history through this. This has been my pleasure and my honor. So 73 right back at you from K8QS.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Quin. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K8QS in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. As I said earlier, we already have presentations posted as they're coming in. I update the website as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.